In part 3, we showed you how to get the button unit out and back in again. In this one, we'll get the button unit completely to pieces and clean it up. Once you're in there, the cleaning is a piece of cake. The challenge is getting it back together again. So the bulk of the time in this movie will be spent on that.
All right, these are your selector rods right here. And you'll notice when the needles are in the non-working position, the rods, they're over the top of the rods. So they're not going to do anything. We're going to select a couple of numbers here. We're going to activate, and look, there you go. That's what we ask it to do. But that's how the selector rods are going to activate the needles from the working position. All right, now we're going to cancel the buttons that we selected. They're still not as snappy as I would like. And what we want to show you is we'll take this retainer off. This is what keeps everybody where they're supposed to be. These two screws and this retainer. All right, here is our cover plate, our retainer bar. You notice the little tang right there. And that's what sits up here when it's in place and spaces it so that these pins have plenty of room to move. So it's on like that. That long pin comes right out. And you'll notice this is the long side and the short side. Short side works the button. The long side actually goes into the selector rod. You can see where these are in the selector rods, and there's the spot for this one right there.
So that's how it's talking to the needles all the way down the bed.
Right here, let's activate this, and you see the lock pin goes into place. But now this, you notice this rod has to follow this path. And when it does that, that's when the selector plate knows to activate the number 1 needle all the way down the bed. All right, we've put this pin back in. This is the long part that goes through the selector rod, but there's a back rail here, and the short end of that pin has to go in that back rail. So that's the tricky part about getting them in and out, is to align it with your other hand so that the short piece, and I think the camera can see right there where it goes through. There you go, beautiful. Where it goes through this back rail right here. Once you take this retaining rail off, we just showed you that all of these pins will fall out if you were to rotate the machine up from the front. The only thing holding them in right now is gravity for the lock pins and the spring load of the button. So if you had the rail, if the whole button rail out, which is this piece and the button rail, we showed you in the previous film how you loosen these screws and lets you slide them out of the way. You take this clip off, and the whole button rail will come out. You have to wiggle it around this retention screw here, but you've got room to do that once you have these ends so that you can move the whole rail over. Once it comes out, then you take this off, and all of the pins and the buttons will just fall apart.
Yeah, it's really, disassembly is really not difficult.
Yes.
Preventing disassembly is the issue.
So what we've done, this would be the last thing you would take off. You get your button unit out, and we show it out in another film. Then you take this off, and disassembly takes care of itself.
And then we'll show you how to put it back together momentarily. Here's the button unit out of the bed. Jack showed you how to get that done in great detail in video number 3 of this series. We found sticky stuff and debris to be cleaned off on the inside of the housing of the unit, some on the clips, some on the shafts of the buttons. As mentioned, these things just fall off as soon as the button unit is out and you wiggle it at all. And with everything completely disassembled, a brass brush, some steel wool, and whatever you like to use as a cleaning solution gets it off quite easily. One of the button shafts also had a slight bend in it, and we assumed that to be the wrong shape because none of the others had it, and Jack straightened it with padded pliers so they'll work better. Sometimes on metal this old, a little bit of the staining doesn't come off, but you can tell with your fingertips running across it whether it's still debris on there, in which case it will feel rough, or just staining.
All right, here we go. We're going to insert the pin for the release. Now you'll notice I'm having to slide this down just enough to line up the slot with the angular slot in the button. Now we worry about the long part in the hole, and there we go. That is in. This is the last thing you line up, is this hole, but you got to be holding this, and you got to be pushing the button in just a little bit, and you start this clip in the bottom hole here, and that gives you freedom of movement to slide the plate, hold the button, and line it up for that. So we have the release button put in. Next button, here we go.
We should mention all these springs, are positioned correctly in the buttons, but they can and they do fall out.
Yes.
There's no problem, however, to just sit one back in. Just don't close it up without them in place, or they won't work at all.
Okay. Short side to the top. We tried doing it wrong, and when we went to put the buttons in, the long side was sticking over the rail, so we know that's not right.
That'll never do.
Right. Again, you start the top, and it lets you have the wiggle room to get that lined up in the bottom rail.
There it goes.
He said not getting it. Okay,
you got it.
Now we got it. You see what you got?
Be sure you put the buttons on in order. They're exactly alike, but you're going to have a hard time knitting if the numbers are not in order.
I will show you what I did. There's 3. There's 4. They're standing up so that the springs will stay in place. 5. So I started with 8 and stood them up all along here, so I know this one is, yes, 2. But you can see when you go to feed the button in, and you only need to depress it just a little bit. What you got to remember is to keep this cancellation rod out of the way of the holes. But short side at the top. So we go over here, and we start it in, and turn it loose. And you notice we've got every other hole because this is where the lock pins go in, the wiggly guys. And we wait till last because if we hold it like this where it's easy to get the buttons in, they're all laying right there anyway.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get all the other buttons in and then come back to you. They're all done in the same manner as numbers 1 and 2. 3 through 8 are just the same.
All right, since I've perfected the technique now, I will show you. Button slightly down so the spring stays in place, but the whole outfit rotated so the gravity is helping me hold these in. Long side in the button slide, short side in the hole, line up the short side. See how easy that was?
Mm-hmm.
Now the wiggle guys.
Which their correct name is what?
These are the lock pins. But you see why I call them that, because you got to wiggle them.
We all see why you call them that, but some mechanics may laugh at you if you say, I'm having trouble with the wiggle guys.
They might, but you ought to hear the names we have for things. I will try to turn this and not lose my gravitational angular. But you see, that's what it is. Once you've wiggled them past their bump, then you line them up in the bottom of the rail hole. And drop them into place. And I promise you, if you rotate this anywhere but vertical to the ground within a few degrees, these guys,
drop them all
they'll
out.
jump out. It's not they drop, they just jump out.
So try to hold them steady and work them in from an angle where gravity continues to assist.
You notice I circle them and they tend to go in easier that way.
Here are all the lock pins going back into place. Jack can't really do it that fast, but he did get pretty fast at it.
All right, now we're going to put the retainer bracket, and here are the features. A stop tang right there. It's a 90-degree top face over the rail, and the tang that I showed you is your spacer. So we line it up, we get our teeny tiny little screws, and as usual, start everything before you tighten anything.
Once this is tightened down, our clips aren't going to run amok anymore. Is that right?
That's correct. So that's why this is the very next thing to prevent them from running amok, which we've chased them all over the floor.
Oh, we've gotten lots of exercise this morning.
All right, let me snug these up. And they are a little tight. I didn't bother sorting which screw came out of which side. They're the same thread pitch and the same size, but they tend to go smoothly where they've lived all their lives, and you may have to put a little pressure on them. You see my finger on the top here, but I'm still 3-fingering these in, and they only go tight. Watch. Ha ha!
So that's the entire button unit.
Yeah, now I promise you, the rise of these should not let it out. So if one of them becomes disoriented, you can see there's a very small bit of shaft sticking through, but they should be just fine.